I think that goes along with the resistance to technology in a very real sense, because you can't do it if your phone is on, if you're carrying your phone everywhere you go, if you're answering your email in timely fashion and all of that. So there is a certain plot against that kind of distancing that some poets feel is necessary. That technology does, and I'm not a Luddite, but I do recognize very much the costs to the writing life and to the life of reflection, and the life of reflection and a writing life, as with Rilke and others, are the same for Gustaf. So that I think in his case, that was quite proper. But as you say, it was a real world, but it wasn't this one. And but it was the one appropriate to the undertaking. I think Ignatian is absolutely a perfect description, in a sense. Ritualized, ascetic in many respects. I was surprised when I had found out, as you did, of all the watches he had. It didn't seem so ascetic. And of course he could dress up in a little slightly dandified fashion. So it wasn't ascetic as in a monkish sense, but in another way, intellectual asceticism. There's a question.
Question.
I'd be very curious about the panelists' perceptions of what the various forms allowed him to do in terms of his writing as archaeologist, historian, wanderer, his writings as a poet, or his writing as a novelist. And how do you see those various forms as being interconnected, related, or as specific outlets for various aspects of what he was really about?
So in a way, both form but also genre, the different types of writing and how they let him do what he did, or maybe different things depending on the type of writing he would undertake, particularly as it relates to the question of recovery or archaeology. Could somebody address that?
So briefly, one of the curious things to me is the novels, which are in a sense difficult to reconcile with the poetic output. They don't seem to me continuous with it, whereas the essay writing does. I think the novels, in a sense, were almost desperate. Now, this could easily be wrong. I've thought about it a lot. Desperate compensation for the purism and silence of the poetry, silences of the poetry, which demand as much attention from the reader as they do from the maker. The novels seem to me really, in a sense, taking on rather popular forms, and a prose that was meant to be accessible, or so, seemed to me an attempt to reach a wider audience, perhaps something that would compensate for the privation of the poetic engagement. I don't know how other people feel about that, but the essays have the same utterly demanding linguistic sculpture as the poems.
Yeah, we were talking about the novels during lunch. It's very strange. One of the things, since I translated so much of Sobin's work, the thing that really stuck in my ear was the sound, the breathing of his own language. And when I read his two novels, what I couldn't get rid of while reading his prose was the breath, the breathing of his own language, which would not let the fiction really advance, no progress. That was always there was always poetry was still in his novels and would not let go of the way the language breathed. So it was very strange for me to read. It was almost like if he was he was trying to dress up as a novelist, dress up his own language as a novelist, but it really wasn't working.
I just have a little quotation here from an article I wrote. Gustaf said, "If poetry could be called the realm of the unexpected, then prose, at least as I see it, is that of the planned, the foreseen." So there was definitely a methodological difference in the way he went about it. He would really structure the novels from the get-go in the way that, as we talked about, the other things were grown in a much different fashion. There would be no coincidence, I don't think, in writing a novel. A couple weird things. One is he used to kind of make me promise that I would write a novel someday, which I won't do, but I always thought it was kind of weird, and I never quite understood, and he would just kind of say, you tell interesting stories, or that was a funny anecdote, and I always wondered kind of what that impulse was about, to try to encourage me, if that was supposed to challenge me or open me up to not being just a poet or just a poet and a critic. But I think in the case of Gustaf's work, I've always resisted the novels a bit, and I think it's partly what Michael said about the popular form of them in a way, but I also see them as extremely allegorical versions of what's happening in a much more implicit, sophisticated, quiet, philosophical way in the poems. And so sometimes I feel like the Greta Garbo figure in that novel, or a couple that's having an affair in Venus Blue, they feel like objective correlatives or corollaries for ideas, or the woman who takes off in her airplane to escape and change her identities. He's kind of didactic in a way in the novels that help me understand the poems even more, but there's a lost sense of mystery for me, for all the mystery that gets built into them. And so, yeah, I don't know what that impulse was to do that in his work, if he felt like concretizing it in characters and speech patterns and like actual stuff happening in a physical space was what it was about. But I think that's the thing that always kept me feeling a little bit like this is where implication tips over into telling me much more than I want to know.
There was at least one other question earlier too. Tony.
I guess this is an anecdotal question. Gustaf went there and read, presumably for 10 years, and one of his poems is sort of an autobiographical account of the things that he read. And yet he lived in this little tiny house and a small office, the cabin, the hut that you can build. Did anybody ever see his library, and what did it look like? And, you know, I mean...
Well, yeah, this wasn't till after Gustaf passed away, but Andrew and I were taken on a tour of his library. It was actually quite extensive, and yeah, part of it was in the basement, I remember.
Part of it was upstairs.
Yeah, and there was actually deep inventory of Gustaf's whole itinerary as a writer could be traced through that library. There were even copies of his student writings. He had, during the time when he wasn't sure what kind of writer he wanted to be, in his college days he published fiction in the college literary magazine, and Andrew and I were quite surprised to see that this was sort of fiction of a tough guy, Hemingway-esque sort, and very different from the sort of writer he eventually became. But no, he kept all of these books very carefully and systematically in his cottage.
I noticed two books that were at his bedside when he was dying, just the week before. And one was the Zohar, and the other was Plotinus. He told me he was reading Plotinus, and for some reason it's not a question about the library, but I just thought when I mentioned that to some people later, everybody resoundingly agreed that was just one of the sort of great moments in human aspiration or something.
More questions?